Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Legal Issues Every Startup Needs to Consider. My name is Reid. I'm the Client Relations Manager at BioNB in Fredericton. And I'm actually here in Moncton today. Glad to be down the highway. Before we jump into the webinar, I'm just going to do a quick intro on BioNB. For those joining us today that don't know as much about us as others, we're not-for-profit, non-government agency that's been around for 20 years. We are the voice of the bioscience sector in the province, and we work with researchers and startups who are trying to commercialize technologies in bioscience. We're working with over 40 startups. Some housekeeping for today's webinar. Carole's going to do the presentation, and we'll do the Q&A at the end, but at any point, if you have a question, you can submit it through the chat box, and I'll be collecting them, and then we'll read them out at the end. And we are going to send, not the slides today, but a handout which has some more detailed information after this webinar to the people in attendance. You can also check out all other BioNB webinar recordings on our website. So I just want to introduce Carole Chan, who's an associate at McInnis Cooper here in Moncton. And I have been working with the startups for almost 2 years now in bioscience, and the team in the office. We've noticed that a lot of legal issues have crept up that I thought it's a really good time to talk about things other than just IP, other than just patents. There's a lot of other things to consider. So I was talking to Carole and said, could you do a webinar on that? Just high level. There's a lot to this, so we're going to skim the surface today. But I'm really happy that Carole is taking the time to do this. As I mentioned, Carole's an associate at McInnis Cooper in Moncton. Her practice focuses on privacy and technology issues in energy, and natural resources, and the agri-food sectors. She completed her law degree at McGill after doing an undergrad degree at Wellesley College, and she was admitted to the bar in Ontario, New Brunswick, and Quebec. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Carole.
Thanks, Ryan. It is like a little radio show here.
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining today. I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you. And with the introduction that Ryan gave, I do appreciate the fact that we're finally being let into the room, so to speak. I think the more you can be prepared, I guess if there's a takeaway and you want to turn your computer off right after this, the more you can be prepared on the front end, the better you are in position to essentially avoid or deal with issues as they come up in the future, and they will come up, legal issues, that is. So what is the value of legal advice? I want to kind of take you through two things today. The first part of it is really how you would set yourself up, and many of you are probably already set up from a corporate perspective to start dealing with issues. But also, I think the other piece is, once you're set up, when do you reach out for more help, or when do you identify times that you may need additional advice? And that second basket can actually apply even if you're not set up as a corporation. If you're a sole proprietorship or a partnership, some of those things may come into play as well. So that is like the whole corpus of corporate law, which we are going to cover in half an hour. and so yeah, I think that's the nutshell of what we're doing. So the first essentially 10 slides, we have a top 10, I guess, of things that should be considered by startups. And the handout that I will be sharing with you through Ryan was prepared by my colleagues in Halifax, Julie Robinson and Rohan Rajpal. And it really walks you through the considerations that you want to think about as you're incorporating, or as you're considering incorporation in particular. But even if you're not, these are things you might want to think about if you would like to eventually sell your business on its success or get financing additionally for it in the future. It's always good to make sure that your governance structure, that your relationships are well documented and well organized from the get-go, so that when you reach those stages where you do need outside help, whether it's through the financing or through a sale or through a partnership with somebody else, when they go and lift the hood, you want to make sure that everything is shined up and polished, and that you don't have to go back and paper things or rearrange things as much as you would if you didn't prepare. So
we've seen that happen.
Yeah.
Because the preparation wasn't done. Yeah.
So, I guess I should just say a word on timing. Oops, sorry. So, in terms of timing, there are a couple things, I guess, a couple key benchmarks that may flag to you that incorporation, in particular, is perhaps desirable. For instance, if you have developed intellectual property that is going to be trade protected in some way, it helps to have that intellectual property being owned by only one person instead of in bits and pieces by different people. So that's where an incorporation vehicle could become very handy. Also, if you're in a position where you'd like to enter into contracts with customers and suppliers, or with employees even, having a corporation will give you the veil of protection to put a fence essentially between your own personal assets and those of the corporation. And finally, of course, if you're looking for funding, it's a much easier way for investors and government grants to have a look at how you work and how well you work. Oops, I'm going backwards now.
I think spacebar.
Oh, okay, great, thanks. So, place of incorporation is up to you, essentially, as you incorporate. You could go for a federal incorporation or a provincial incorporation, or if you plan to operate somewhere else entirely, perhaps that other jurisdiction would be appropriate. What you want to consider in this instance, and what you should be talking about essentially with your legal advisor and your other advisors, is how investor ready are you? Do you know your market? Because once you know your market, you'll know what they're looking for. And if you, for instance, incorporated in New Brunswick, but your market is all in Ontario, they might be more accustomed to looking at federal incorporation rather than a New Brunswick incorporation. Even though they're not dramatically different, it still makes it easier for the due diligence process at a subconscious level, even at the very least. If you have flexibility in terms of making changes, you can always, I guess, incorporate in those other jurisdictions. If you, for instance, started in New Brunswick and wanted to move into other areas, you could certainly do extra provincial registrations or change your incorporation, but that always takes time and more money. So planning a little on the front end, thinking it out a little bit on the front end should save you a lot of time and effort in the longer term. Not to say that some of those things won't happen just because you've thought about it, but
a lot of our companies, they're in New Brunswick, but the markets are all outside. So should they just go federal corporation, or does it depend on every
outside
situation?
Means if outside means outside of New Brunswick, and they're looking for the funding, if that's what you mean by markets, not where they're selling their product.
Where they're selling the product, yeah.
Oh, where they're selling the product into may not make that much of a difference.
Okay.
I think it depends on what other kinds of permits and regulation they are subject to. But this is really more for we're talking about if they are going to look for financing for their company, and that angel entity or that investor is essentially going to be doing their due diligence. You want to have things, as I mentioned before, in a format and in good shape so that they can assess it, and it's easier sometimes for them to assess if it's in their own language, so to speak. So that's all. It's not impossible to change from a New Brunswick incorporation to a federal incorporation, and it's not the most cost prohibitive thing either. But it's nice to think about on the front end. Name, of course, very important. I'm sure Ryan and his team at BioNB have chatted with a few of you about your names as you've developed your ideas and brought them together. But really important from the front end to do at least some very basic searches to make sure you can use those names. Later on, you may want to get into the trademarking of those names and logos, but start off on the right foot and make sure at least you're not infringing on somebody else's rights. Now, share structure is something that within an incorporation, it will help you decide how you structure the capital essentially, and how you'll be able to get it back eventually for the shareholders. So there are different ways to do it. And I think for those of you who are founders, of course, the important part is, first of all, identifying who among a group are actual founders and who are going to be there for the longer term. Because if you are that kind of person, you may consider founder shares, so to speak, so that the equity you put in essentially is your blood, sweat, and tears for a certain amount of time, and it's helpful. The next few slides, I think you'll find, are very much aligned with developing a business plan, but they essentially legalize your business plan, and they give your business plan some beef and the ability for those involved in your business plan to, first of all, know what to expect, but also have a recourse if those expectations are not being met. Which brings me to the I Heart Certainty slide of a shareholders agreement. When you have multiple shareholders, you're bound and almost destined to have certain points of disagreement potentially, and instead of pretending that that's never going to happen, a shareholders agreement says, okay, well, there will be pain points, so how are we going to deal with it? What is the process for dealing with these pain points? And investors, I think, first of all, they like to know that you've thought about it, because if they're investing in a company that has shareholders, they want to know that, first of all, their investment is going to be well received, and or if it's going to be considered by the shareholders, how are they going to consider it? What are their expectations as investors? And the other piece is they may want to influence that shareholders agreement ultimately as well, to say, okay, well, now that we're buying in or we're going to invest, we want X and Y to happen. So if you take the time on the front end to consider what those pain points could potentially be, how you want to resolve them, and when you're going through that process, you should be able to identify what's really important to you. Because I think every founder is different. Some founders may just want to just pump out ideas and sell them at the best value. And then some other founders, you make something, it's your baby, and you want your stamp on it forever and ever and ever. And so those agreements and terms and conditions will reflect differently in different agreements. You look like you want to say something, Ryan.
Well, I don't want to take too much your time, but this is where in my 20 years of being in startup world, this is where I've seen lots of nightmares, and I've been involved in them. So this is really important. And to your point about, if NBIF or First Angel Network or any investor is going to expect all this stuff to be in place, so you're either going to have to do it to get that money, and it might slow things down if you don't have this stuff, or at least, like Carole says, you haven't thought these things out. Yeah, this is to me, this is the one highlight that I like. Yeah.
In some ways, it's like a prenup.
Yeah.
Because you hope you won't be going to most of the points that you consider, but it's more than that, because for companies to grow, you often have to invite others to join, get financing from outside sources, and even get talent from outside sources and have disagreements about them, and I think it's important. It's incumbent on everyone to think about it seriously from the start, and have somebody walk. And that's, I suppose, the role of your legal advisor, essentially. And I think your accountant probably would have quite a bit to say as well, in terms of how best to manage what you have. But it's a good way to basically have somebody actualize how you feel about this project of yours. And speaking of bringing in new talent, stock option plans are often used to attract and motivate and retain talent where cash is not plentiful. So structuring those options correctly is similar to the shareholders agreement. You want to make sure, again, talking to your financial and legal advisors, that you have what you need in place to make them happen, and always try to know what your aspirations are, and know what the likely realities are of your situation, so that you can craft each of these documents to aim for those aspirations, but not find yourself essentially in violation of terms and agreements as you go, just because your expectations were set so high and your terms and conditions are just not being met on a regular basis. You want to make sure you are meeting your obligations that you set out. Of course, IP. I think Ryan mentioned that many folks have spoken to you about IP, and IP is the base of most of your businesses, I believe. So it really is an important part of all of your businesses. I was recently. I was at we were both at the Big Data conference as well, and I think data is actually one of those things like IP that really touches many of your businesses, and should also be considered in the I probably need a slide 7.1 or 7.2 now to add big data or any data, because the data that you gather, that you use in your business, particularly in the tech sector, can be almost of more value, I think, than the IP that you develop. And so knowing how to identify it, determine who owns it, and protect it, those are just as important as going out and getting a copyright or a patent on something. Ryan's nodding again, so I'm going to let him talk.
That's a great point, because a lot of our companies are collecting a lot of data as part of their project. Yeah,
and I might as well take the opportunity, now that I'm just talking about data and data protection. Privacy and security is something that cybersecurity that is equally important. I think some of the folks on the line probably deal with personal information that is being gathered, and if that's being gathered at any level, but in particular if it's being gathered en masse, and in particular if it's about health, a startup, or a company really of any size, but if you are a startup and you're trying to break into this business, understanding the the regulatory regimes around those areas, the risk management aspect of that area of law is really crucial to ensuring the success of your business, in the sense that you don't want to be ever slapped with a fine, first of all. It's bad enough if you have a data breach, but you really don't want to go into the zone of being slapped with a fine, not only because the fines can be large, but they can be small, they can be large, but really once the PR factor kicks in, there's a lot of repair to do. So understanding that if you are dealing in those areas, it's like if you are dealing with radioactive material, you want to know that you are properly purchasing, transporting, handling all those things from public safety and health level. Same goes for data that involves personal information. Now, that other data that we were talking about, the kind of more general data, I think that still is a huge area to be conquered, in terms of determining who owns exactly the data. I think there are lots of different business models out there right now that reflect the fact that companies, big and small, haven't exactly identified data as an asset. And so if you can move in early and do that, or do it as you're building your business, which involves data, that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah.
A couple other key agreements you want to think about on the front end are the reverse vesting for founders, employment agreements I mentioned earlier, and contractor agreements, because they're all going to have to fit in with your business plan and with your general plans. And again, set your expectations high, but make sure you can meet them, so that you won't be in contravention of your terms and conditions. And I'm going to do a little plug for my colleague Lucy, who's in this office in Moncton. She'll be over at Venn Center on November 29th, doing a top 5 employment presentation for startups. So employment issues, whether it's hiring, firing, managing, those things will be covered by Lucy at the Venn Center on the 29th.
And Carole, this employment agreements, contract agreements, that would include confidentiality, which is really important, I think.
Absolutely.
Those are in there, and NDA, non-disclosure agreement, could be part of it. So these are really, and I see that these can sometimes be forgotten about, or not forgotten about, or just not done in the hurly-burly of a startup, but they can come back to haunt you.
Yeah.
Down the road.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. I think if we go back to the IP slide, whether or not you actually go out and apply for a copyright or a patent or trademark, having a plan in place first that demonstrates agreement among those who have decision-making power, and a process to put legs on that agreement, that's probably step 0 of the application, of going out to get that application. And your lawyer can help you also decide whether it's whether it's good enough that you have that, or you really should be going out and getting a patent or a copyright. So I think having counsel who's experienced in the IP sector doesn't just mean somebody who can fill out your application form for you and push it through. You really want to lean on them for that advice of working the IP program into your business plan and giving it robust life. So financing, of course, is probably the most important, or I wouldn't say the most important, but it's a very, very important feature of any company that is going to grow. And and as you know, there are different kinds of financing available, but the key at this stage is make sure you understand what they are, and how they fit in, again, with your business plan and with all those, I guess, founding principles that you've set out for yourself. And founding principles can change because, or founding principles are what they are, but they can evolve over time because the company may grow, the founders may come and go. But if you have strong processes in place, which is what we talked about on the front end, you can adapt to those changes, and it should be easier to go off and get the financing later. And corporate governance, I think it kind of overlays everything we've been talking about. It is essentially the process, practices, and structures through which a corporation manages its business and affairs and works to meet its objectives. It defines the roles that each of the shareholder board of directors, officers, employees, and staff will play, how the reporting system is set up, and those, I mean, that's probably what most people think about when they think about corporations, but it really should incorporate all those other slides we talked about on the front end, because you want to know that these folks and these roles are informed by all those other pieces that we touched on earlier. And another plug. Oh, look at that. So it actually really is quite timely that that Ryan invited us, because this year we've rolled out our McInnis Cooper startup package, and it's a really interesting package because it's designed to bank on your success. We're offering key legal documents, a small initial fee, which I believe it's about $400 for about $5,000 worth of service, and the remainder is deferred until either your success on certain kinds of financing, or if there is no success, then that's our investment in the sector, and there you go. So we also do have a retainer program for those companies that are already set up and need a little bit of fee certainty as they go.
Yeah.
And that's available as well through McInnis Cooper. Finally, I just wanted to throw this slide in, your law firm as your legal toolkit, because I think, as advertised in our little blurb, it's really important to understand how lawyers and your law firm works, and so that they can work most efficiently for you. One thing, and I hope something that you can take away from this presentation and also the handout that Ryan will be sending to you, is once you familiarize yourself with some of those key issues, take the time to think about it, and touch base with your legal advisor on those things. But our legal advice and services are only as good as the input. I think, isn't there something in data programming?
Yeah, garbage in,
garbage out. So if you bring us, and it doesn't mean to say that you have to bring things tied up with a bow. That's our job. But getting to know yourself, having hard discussions, or even considering having hard discussions with the partners you're working with, is really important, because we can't make things happen if you don't want us to make those things happen, or don't know how to tell us to make those things happen. The other piece is that a law firm, in particular one like ours that is larger, will have lawyers who practice in different areas. And so if you're looking to just get incorporated and do the startup, that will generally take a corporate commercial lawyer. Once you get to the point where where you're in an adversarial situation, having a commercial litigator would be useful. My specialization floats more in the regulatory areas, and that can be helpful, I would say, in particular in the transactional context for specific areas, but also in the day-to-day operations. And same for labor and employment. It's really more about it can be just as much about your day-to-day operations and how things work out and how you practice things, as creating these contracts and arguing about them in court. So don't be afraid of batting a few ideas around, to get a sense of whether it's worth drilling down. And one example I think we touched on is really the management of personal information and data. I think a lot of companies, for instance, will understand that privacy is an important issue, and everybody has a privacy policy on their website. And Apple's privacy policy is probably pretty good, so I'm going to just use the same terms and conditions as them, which generally works. I mean, a lot of the terms are the kinds of things you would want to see in a privacy policy. But what I would do as a legal advisor in that situation is really sit down with the company and say, okay, how are you actually going to accomplish all of this? Because what they have is probably the gold standard, but can you make the gold standard happen for yourselves? And what happens if you don't? So what's the silver or bronze standard that you might want to go for instead? Try to find something that fits where you are and fits your needs. So with that, we have legal alerts like the one that you will be receiving, but lots in other areas that are on our website. And because we are privacy lawyers and we don't want to contravene any anti-spam laws, we would invite you to come and subscribe at your convenience and let us know what you're interested in. So there you go.
Great, thanks, Carole. I'm just going to pull up some questions here, see if we've got anything that's come in. I had a question when, and this has come up. I've noticed a hesitancy, not just in our world, but in others, that people are afraid to go to a lawyer because they think the clock starts on the billing the minute they walk in the door. So how does that, you want to, so somebody out there says, I think I need to go talk to somebody. So how should they find a lawyer? And then, what are they being charged? When does that start?
Well, I think a lawyer should always tell somebody when they're going to be charged. Yep. Typically, if you're just walking in to figure out what your issue is, I don't charge my clients to talk to them and figure out why they're even here. There are certain areas of law where it's a little more obvious that intake process is part of the exercise and is an important part of the exercise. For instance, immigration, like you have to talk to that person and hear their story in order to give them advice on how it goes. So in those instances, there may be a set consultation fee, but again, that should be very clear before you even walk in the door, or so that you know that you're not being charged for the time you sit there and talk to your lawyer at the get-go.
Okay. And how would you find a lawyer?
Well, Google's a great resource. I think I think lawyers work with people and companies, and they work with other trusted advisors like accountants and bankers and engineers. So I think if you're already in that game, I mean, if you already have a banker that you like, that you trust, ask that person who they work with. Yeah,
that's how I found a lawyer for us. Yeah.
That being said, there are a lot of, and I was being a little bit facetious when I was mentioning Google, but there are certainly websites out there that provide lots of information and can give you a sense of whether that kind of lawyer is appropriate for you. But a lawyer should be a trusted advisor, and you are entrusting them with your business. So if you, at the trust level, I think word of mouth probably makes the most sense.
Okay. And the profession is divided up into specialties. So, there's the generalist lawyer, might just be working on their own, but there's also, you want to find somebody, it seems like, that actually does the area of law that you're talking about. So you're not necessarily going to have the same lawyer for every piece of what you just laid out here. Like it's kind of like a team that you have to.
If you're lucky enough to get a team and to afford a team, I will say afford, because it can add up in cost. That is what you get. A lot of generalists, particularly in this part of Canada, have to touch on those areas because we don't have critical mass right now for companies for firms generally to specialize. A firm like ours and our fellow large firms out there probably do have a few folks who do more specialized work in a sector or in an area of law, but that's only a percentage of the province. So.
Okay. And just for the everybody in the audience, BioNB and our clients have worked with lawyers all over, different ones. And the IP, typically the patent stuff, because it's bioscience, they tend to be firms, in Ontario, and a lot of them in the U.S. because that's where the market is, especially in pharmaceutical and healthcare. So there's those, like you say, Chicago, New York, Boston. There's firms that just do bioscience patent law, so they can. Yeah,
and patents in particular, where it comes to IP, are very, very specific to the kind of science that you're dealing with, to the kind of invention that you're dealing with. So, so that really requires that they're in that space, that they have that expertise, and I think there are a few patent agents here in Atlantic Canada, but whether they actually meet your needs is something else.
If anybody has questions, just put them into that chat box. And we just have a comment from the audience that Shop Law is a website. I think I've heard of it. It compares New Brunswick law services and prices online. I don't know if you've heard of that, or
I found it on Google the other day too. I think we're 7 minutes over.
Yeah, so we're near the end. We haven't got any more questions, but I wonder. I'm gonna email out the handout that Carole has, which is great. And I wondered if can I include your contact info if anybody wanted to just email you and ask you a question as follow up.
Sure.
That'd be okay.
Absolutely.
So I'll send that out this afternoon or first thing in the morning. And if you have any questions for Carole, you can reach out to her. And we're going to be having another webinar in December on clean tech. So some more information about that will be coming out soon, but there's a lot of confusion around what clean tech is, and we're going to help try and clear it up a little bit, talk about the opportunities in that area. So thanks so much, Carole, for taking the time out of your busy day to speak with our group. This was a really well-attended webinar. I think this is a timely topic, an important one, so I appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.